Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Katie Charles, and I am one of our athletic recruiting specialists here at Great Expectations College Prep. I have been with Great Expectations for 9 years. And prior to that, I spent 9 years as a college coach and admissions liaison at a variety of schools, everything from small Division III through major Power 5 Division I. So I've been around for quite a while and have been working with student athletes, helping them understand the athletic recruiting process, college counseling and planning, and how to best leverage their athletic goals to get to the college level.
Hi, my name is Galen Dodd. I'm one of the other athletic recruiting specialists here at Great Expectations. I recently joined on to assist Katie and our athletes. I spent the last couple of years, 4 or 5 years in Division I athletics, did a little bit of college counseling there, and now I'm back just helping students out. And fun fact, I went to Pally.
So he gets to present in front of his home crowd tonight. All right, we're going to be kicking this party off tonight, and we're going to be discussing tonight specifically NCAA recruiting, but athletic recruiting and the differentiation between divisions for the NCAA athletics. The first place we like to start is kind of how does anybody know what division schools are and what's the difference between them? One of the biggest misnomers in college athletics is that the divisions are decided by school size. Everybody just assumes that the biggest schools are Division I, the smallest schools are Division III, and everything kind of in the middle falls into Division II. Ironically, not at all how it's divided. The divisions are actually divided entirely based on schools' decision of where they want to be and how much they're willing to fund their athletic program. Division I requires a certain number of athletic programs as a threshold. So it's 16 total sports within the department. They need at least 7 of them to be women's sports. So they're trying for at least marginal equity across the board. And then on top of that, they have to fund to a certain level, which is decided actually by their conference rather than by the NCAA level, with the maximum scholarship allotment for each sport decided by the NCAA's main office. Division I has 2 different kinds of options when it comes to scholarship. There is what we call a head count sport, which means 1 scholarship, 1 athlete. So they can't divide them up. They have to be given to 1 athlete. That's how it counts. An example of a head count sport would be men's and women's basketball, football, women's volleyball. Those are kind of our big ones that are all guaranteed head count sports. The second one is the partial scholarship model, and that's any sport that is below a full allotment. So baseball would be an example. They have 9.2 scholarships. Men's volleyball is 4.5. The coaching staff can decide to divvy up their athletic scholarships in any way that they want to. So they could give one kid a full one and another kid $500. And as long as they don't exceed the total value, they can give those scholarships out in any way that they decide. That's for Division I. For Division II, everything follows that model. So everything is able to be divvied up amongst as many athletes as they want. The one benefit of Division II is they can actually roll in academic money without it affecting scholarships. D2 kind of has an agreement amongst themselves, given where their division has been for the last several years. They are our smallest division at a maximum of about 180 schools participating in Division II. And so with them, they are all in the partial scholarship model. Division III, on the other hand, is our one division that does not offer any athletically based scholarship. They can offer scholarship for academics, for demographic reasons. They can offer for any reason the school chooses, but it has to be scholarship money that is open to the general student population and cannot be earmarked directly for athletics. When we're moving through this, the biggest difference most people assume in terms of sports is the difference in exposure. Yes, you're going to see a lot more Division I athletics on television, although now we are actually seeing a solid chunk of Division II and Division III being covered either via live stream or on ESPN. Actually, there's been quite a few Division II athletic endeavors that have been showing up on the ESPN Plus app. So we're starting to see at least a little bit of expansion there, which is great for everyone involved. But our biggest differentiation comes in the actual experience for our students on campus, the funding behind it. Everybody hears the talking heads on ESPN complaining about the sheer volume of money that everyone spends in Division I. They are significantly more well-funded, but across the board, interestingly enough, athletics at every college, whether Division I, Division II, or Division III, is funded exactly like the music department and exactly like other extracurriculars. You have a budget, and if you exceed it, you have to find a way to fundraise for it. And that's where all the athletics boosters come in. Division I is where we see most of that impact. Obviously, the budgets are significantly higher at that level, and the students are getting a lot more stuff. It's why you see their, Nike Christmas on the Instagram of every athletic program when they're opening up all their good stuff on day one of preseason. The second one is going to be travel. At the Division I level, especially in what we call the Power 5 conferences, which is about to become, I think, the Power 3 conference, if anybody's been following the current level of conference alignment. But our Power 5 conferences, depending on sports, are generally the Big 10, the Big 12, the SEC, the ACC, and the Pac-12. Moving forward, it sounds like it's going to be 3 conferences, which will be the Big 10, the ACC, and whatever the SEC conglomerate is about to become. And we'll see where everybody else falls after that. But across the board, the travel is significantly more expensive. You're looking, and significantly farther. You're looking at charter flights. They're traveling multiple days a week. They're missing a significant amount of class. And by division, that drops at each level. You become more regional, especially at Division II, and in Division III, it's even in sub-regional. A lot of league and conference play with limited out of conference, which means you're on a bus going wherever you're going, but you're usually not traveling more than 6 to 8 hours at a time, which is nice. The third big piece of this that is different for all the divisions is the student athlete experience. It's how much time you're going to be spending doing athletic related activity. At the Division I level, no matter whether you're a scholarship athlete or not, it is a job. It is more than 40 hours a week of committed activity on top of your class time. Great experience. Students absolutely love it, but understand sports a lot of times will come first, and oftentimes your class schedule is going to have to work around a practice schedule. Division II, it's a little bit more of a balance. And at Division III, academics and outside activities are more the priority. In season, student athletes have their sport very intensively, and out of season, they have a lot of time to do other extracurriculars and be involved in additional things on campus. So when we talk a lot about athletics, especially as we're talking about the desired college experience of student athletes, we talk to them a lot about what are they interested in doing outside of the classroom. If sports is their big thing, then Division I might be something that they're shooting for. If they're hoping to study abroad or they're interested in doing a bunch of internships, then we're probably talking Division II or Division III, simply based on the kind of college experience they're going to be looking for. We're going to be moving ahead. We're going to be starting to talk a little bit here about terminology and things that you might be hearing when we talk about athletics. And Galen's going to take it away on our Recruiting 101 section.
Yeah, so a little bit about the nuts and bolts of NCAA eligibility. And this applies for our academic eligibility and our amateur status for Division I and Division II student athletes. And for the academic requirement that we're looking at is a set of 16 core courses and a minimum GPA. And then with that, there's some sliding scales between the core course GPA and the SAT and the ACT to help determine that academic requirement. And on top of that, the big thing to remember is the NCAA isn't there to determine the eligibility. It's just there. The NCAA is there to determine the eligibility, but not to provide that guidance. That's something that you should be helping yourself through the guidance counselor at your office, or through Katie or I kind of here at Great Expectations, we can help with that. A little bit about that NCAA Eligibility Center. It used to be known as the Clearinghouse, and then it kind of came under this one big umbrella. And it really helped unite Division I, Division II athletics. If you're confident that you're going to be playing college sports, it's definitely a good idea to be doing the NCAA Clearinghouse and the Eligibility Center. We recommend that you often do it between your sophomore and junior year. Katie in a little bit is going to talk about some of the timeline with recruiting, and that summer between our sophomore and junior year is definitely an important one to remember, and that's why I'm bringing it up with the Eligibility Center. The last thing to kind of remember with the Eligibility Center is you need to be sure you're submitting your official transcripts, your test scores, and just going through the entire process, and it takes about half an hour to do.
Yeah, the NCAA Eligibility Center it's nothing super exciting. And as Galen touched on, it's definitely a sliding scale. The NCAA is there to determine whether or not you hit baseline, not whether or not you're admissible to the schools you're considering. The sliding scale looks like this. If you're anywhere above a 3.0 GPA, you need like a 770 total on your SATs between two sections in order to be eligible, which I think equates to about a 16 on the ACTs. So they're not looking for you to necessarily whether or not you're going to be admissible to the schools you're considering. They just want to know whether or not you've hit the baseline standards for athletic functionality at the college level. And as Galen hit on, D1 and D2 have it. D3 does not look at it at all and will not require anything with the Eligibility Center. All right, so we're going to jump a little bit into the actual recruiting rules by division. Like I said, Galen did a nice job of introing the fact that the most important summer is between sophomore and junior year. This is the summer when communication becomes a factor, and it really allows student athletes the time to get to know and interact with college coaches for the potential of recruiting. This is where we see a little bit of differentiation, actually our biggest differentiation in divisions. Division 1 and Division 2, again, are following relatively the same rules. And they did this because, quite frankly, we used to have a 400-page rule book that was absolutely a nightmare to get through, and every division had their own rules. So D1 and D2, where scholarships were involved, thank goodness, finally said, you know what, we'll just keep our rules relatively the same. And Division 3 is off doing its own thing like they always are. So for Division 1 and Division 2, athletes, for the most part, there are a couple of exceptions. Football is an exceptional one. Men's and women's basketball have slightly different recruiting rules. And the rules that govern each sport can be found on the ncaa.org website. But across the board, the general rule of thumb is that student athletes can technically reach out to a college coach at any time, at any point. So even as a freshman, they can write to them. But up until June 15th, at the end of your sophomore year, college coaches cannot respond to student athletes beyond a simple online questionnaire or baseline questionnaire format and a camp invite. Outside of that, they can have no direct communication with student athletes that are contacting them at any time. So even if they see them out there at a tournament, you can't stop and talk to a coach. They can't respond to an email or a text. And technically, if they pick up your phone call, it's an NCAA violation, and they have to report themselves. So we always do our best to make sure that the student athletes understand the rules, because it can be a problem for college coaches if you're contacting them and they miss what your graduation date is. They can actually get in trouble at the NCAA level for that. With that, the recruiting process can theoretically start hot and heavy on June 15th. However, most kids assume they're going to get 300 calls that day. That doesn't generally happen. The recruiting process, while it can kick off on June 15th, from the time that the communication opens, it's usually a 12 to 18 month process until we whittle down to where most student athletes are going to fall from a recruiting perspective. So remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint as you're considering this. So if you don't hear it from a ton of schools on day one, don't panic. Now, again, Division 3 off doing their own thing. Gotta love them. They are allowed to respond to a student at any time. Coaches can have contact with athletes at any time. It is completely open communication for all of Division 3, primarily because there's actually no benefit to it. They cannot offer you any scholarship money, so it's not as if there's an exchange of finances involved in the application and recruitment process. So for Division 3, they really can. However, as a marginal aside and a thing to understand, a lot of student athletes get incredibly frustrated when college coaches do not respond. Division 1 and Division 2, half the time can't respond. They technically are not allowed to. And for Division 3, the staffing there is usually a lot smaller than Division 1 and Division 2. I can tell you right now, we're at mid-October. I had to look at the date. Yes, I did. We're at mid-October, and most of the Division 3 schools are still considering which seniors are going to be applying. So they most likely are still focused primarily on senior student athletes. They are going to be picking up the juniors starting around the winter time once the early decision applications have passed. And they won't have even gotten to sophomores or freshmen yet. It's going to take them some time to figure out where they're going to be. So the number one thing when it comes to recruiting and all of these big recruiting rules that I remind students is to be patient. A lot of things will change from the end of sophomore year when things can actually begin happening all the way through to senior year.
Kind of touching back base on the recruiting calendar. Again, a lot of this recruiting calendar is assuming that you've already reached through that sophomore year, going to the junior year. And starting with that contact period, this is where communication is pretty fair game. Coaches are allowed pretty full contact. It can be phone calls, emails, text messages. They can communicate on Instagram if they really want to. they're watching you off campus. They're allowed to do home visits and other types of meetings. They're allowed to come and watch you play. This is kind of that fair game recruiting time. The next one is our quiet period, where coaches can't have in-person contact. And that's really that key difference in the quiet period is the in-person contact. Communication's still open. You're still having dialogue via phone, and they can even have students on campus during that time. The dead period, it's right around that kind of early signing period in November. And it's when coaches can have no face-to-face contact with their college-bound student athletes or their parents. That's just to kind of help alleviate a little bit of the pressure around signing week. And again, during that time, we can still communicate via phone, email, social media, and other digital platforms. And the big thing with that is if you're getting an NLI, is it's going to be coming through electronically, and that's where you want to have that communication.
Yeah, this has certainly changed a lot. There actually used to be a fourth option on the recruiting calendar terms, which was the evaluation period. The NCAA, again, in recent years, for the sanctity of getting easier, has eliminated some of these things. And the new vote that just went through for this coming January is they're going to eliminate even quiet periods now. So recruiting calendars are going to be entirely open. We're unsure what that's going to look like or what the benefit exactly of that is going to be, but it's certainly going to make life an adventure. The dead period has gone down to, it used to be 6 weeks a year. We're down to 4 days. So they really have done away with all of this and are trying to make this more streamlined and more friendly to athletes so that they have more opportunity to speak with and interact with coaches before making a decision. As Galen was talking about, this is all hinged around the NLI. And the story was, it used to be college coaches would show up at a kid's house with the paperwork in hand, and the top choices would have like 5 coaches there, and they'd all be standing there with paperwork, pressuring the kid basically into signing, which is what the NCAA did in terms of removing the dead period from there. But moving forward, it's mostly just become kind of a habit now, and everybody does this electronically. All right, the next question is the big question for all of our student athletes, and that is, how do I get recruited? One of the biggest things that student athletes come to us with is, when should I start the recruiting process? And actually, to be fair, the one thing the parents usually ask is, when should we start the recruiting process? And my answer to that question is always, whenever your student athlete is ready to do the work. When you're starting this process and when you're getting into it, college coaches want to hear directly from student athletes. And this goes into the best way to contact schools. College coaches have very busy schedules, and they're likely receiving anywhere from 100 to 500 emails a day from recruits, depending on the size of their school and how big their programs are. So remember, there's a lot of activity going on. So persistence is key, but not driving them nuts is also kind of where we want to draw the line on all of this. If you're paying attention to the recruiting calendars and you know what you're looking for, starting as a freshman or a sophomore with a very broad list, usually for underclassmen, I recommend considering somewhere between 50 and 75 schools, which is, again, a place where we can help you as counselors, or where your guidance office can talk to you of academically what you might be on track for and the kinds of schools you should be considering, and helping you guys to build a list that are going to meet your needs so that you have a wide variety of schools. In the recruiting process, you're going to hear no a lot, and you're going to say no a lot. There's going to be some schools that are very obviously not good fits for you that might reach out. And there might be some places that you want to go where you're not a good fit for their program. So understanding the wider the net that we cast, the more likely we're going to have success. Within reason, we obviously don't want to just, throw spaghetti at the wall and hope something sticks. But the general idea here is to find a thoughtful list of schools that meet your needs from an academic perspective, an athletic perspective, and a student experience perspective, and then try to see which ones are going to fit best for you in the long term. The best way to contact coaches, especially in the initial stages, is email. I know high school students genuinely despise email, but you're going to have to learn to deal with us old people who are on the other end of this receiving these things. The second best thing you can do for yourself is to fill out the online student athlete recruiting questionnaire. Nearly every school in the country has one. I'm not saying it always gets where it's supposed to go, but the idea here is, on those questionnaires, when you fill them out, they go into a back-end system at the colleges that shares the information both with the athletic coach. So they'll get an email with all of your information in it that says, hey, the student filled out the questionnaire, take a look at them and see if you're interested. The other place it goes is admissions. And especially if you're considering any of the higher academic schools, demonstrated interest can be something the schools are looking for. And they will also have open communication with their athletic departments saying, oh, hey, this kid, sent us information or they're in our database and they're listing your sport, is this a kid that you're interested in? And so there is communication that goes back and forth between athletics and the admissions office. And what do you need to do before you start contacting schools? The number one thing I recommend for students is to get organized and do research. Pay attention to what the students are up to. Think about their experience. You all have social media accounts. I can pretty much guarantee that. So you might as well use your time you're scrolling Instagram for good. Take a look at the admissions pages, follow the athletes or the athletic departments, Instagram accounts, the sport that you're following. Try to get as much information on what the programs are up to and get out and see them if you possibly can. It's always good to know whether or not a school might be a good fit prior to starting the writing process. All right, so we're gonna keep rolling through here and kind of talk a little bit about how athletics can factor into the admissions process. The first and foremost, and this is the kind of the pie in the sky, everybody hears about this and they're like, oh, I'm going to get a scholarship if I'm going to play a sport in college. The current statistics tell us that only 2% of high school athletes are going to go on to play at the college level. And of that, only about 15% will be on scholarship when they do it. And so the likelihood of receiving a scholarship is actually not as good as most people think. I always tell student athletes you have a far better chance of going to college because you're a good student who plays a sport than you are because you're good at a sport. While most rosters have a certain number of scholarship space, they're always happy to take high-end students who are great for their program that can also play their sport at a decent level. So there's room for really great students. When we're talking about the scholarship side of this, receiving a scholarship can mean a little bit of anything. The assumption is that if you're receiving a scholarship, you're getting your whole school paid for. For most sports, that is not the case. Outside of those major headcount sports, most student athletes are paying some fraction of their college tuition outside of the scholarship money. A scholarship can be as small as, we'll use this example because I think they've finally changed, but UC San Diego's entire scholarship used to be $500 for books, which by the way, covered about one book in today's prices. So it really wasn't helping anybody, but every student athlete, no matter what, only got $500. That was the maximum scholarship amount. So even though they could say they were scholarship athletes, it didn't really mean a whole lot in the grand scheme of college tuition. The scholarship does have one bonus in that it has a slightly different admissions process. College coaches will help with the entirety of it, and it's sport by sport and school by school, but they will walk you through a slightly different process. You'll still need to, for the most part, send in your application, send in essays, send in transcripts, all the same things other students, that it just goes through a different department. And so it's more guaranteed and there's more information involved in it. What that means for financial aid is you can still apply for need-based financial aid. That is something that your family can get whether you're on a partial scholarship or not. If you're on a full scholarship, obviously the financial aid would not be available to you. And with full scholarships and even partial scholarships, a lot of colleges are now offering what we call a cost of attendance stipend, which means you get a certain amount of money per semester for living expenses since you can't be on work study if you're playing a college sport. Okay. What does it mean when you get to college if you're an athlete? It means you're going to be there for sports. And so that's another thing to consider, whether or not the scholarship is something that you want to be held to. We talk with student athletes a lot of times, and this is something we come up against significantly, is students always say to us, you know, I really like my sport, but I'd really like to use it just to get into school, and I'm not sure what I want to do. And when we talk to student athletes about this, we always say that you want to walk into the recruiting process assuming you're going to participate for all 4 years. College coaches' life, livelihood, and paychecks depends on whether or not student athletes stay in their program. There are actual metrics that the colleges follow, like the APR scores. And if your program isn't graduating student athletes, you can get dinged and you can lose your job for it. And so the college coaches, their responsibility is to bring in students that are going to help their program and be a benefit to the community as a whole. Okay. And so when we go through this process, really consider whether or not you're willing to commit the amount of time required to the sport of your choice, and then continue with the recruiting process if you believe it's something that you really want to do. However, the whole second part of this is the idea of commitment. We see this about every 5 minutes on Instagram, if you follow any kind of the major sports, that somebody is committing to a school. Committing to a school, it does not necessarily mean they're receiving a scholarship. It means they're committed to the application process and to being part of the program should they be admitted. My tagline / joke for this is verbal commitments are exactly as good as the paper they're written on. In terms of if a coaching change happens or an AD change happens, there's no guarantee that a verbal commitment will turn into a full commitment until the national letter of intent is signed, or until a student who might be a walk-on is admitted and signs their financial aid agreements. That is when everything becomes binding for both parties, either, like I said, either NLI signing or at the signing of your financial aid agreement and documents and your enrollment into the college. This can happen at any time. And we touched on a little bit earlier about why that June 15th at the end of sophomore year is important, is some people can start committing as early as that. It would be a little strange, and it's not exactly at the top end of my recommendation list to commit to the very first phone call you get, but it does happen. There are obviously some athletes that very much know exactly where they want to go, and an offer comes from their top choice school. They take it, we're done, and they get to, well, hopefully not sit around, but theoretically spend 2 years knowing where they're going to college and being prepared for all of that. But like I said, the binding portion of this doesn't happen for 2 more years after that date. So you have plenty of time to make decisions, to grow, to become better in your sport, and to take the time to do what you need to do. And the commitment works the same for walk-ons as it does for scholarship athletes. It's committing to the process. And again, assuming nothing goes wrong, I always, again, tell student athletes, just assuming that you don't, it's all binding, assuming that you don't rob a bank or fail out of school between the time you commit and the time you're supposed to enroll at the college. All right, we're going to cover a little bit of this one, and I'm going to let Galen kick this puppy off because he just got done with the COVID seasons of coaching during the fall of humanity for a couple of years. So,
oh, it was a lot of fun having nearly 27 people on a roster, which is kind of those two big bullet points right there. Is COVID had an impact where we had larger rosters. When COVID happened, it gave the student athletes an extra year of eligibility that didn't count towards their kind of career, where we talk about you have basically 5 years to play 4 seasons of your sport. And so COVID gave a lot of those student athletes that extra year. So you would see some super seniors with their 6th year of eligibility coming back to play. And that really just trickled down, because as those students are still in there, you're also still recruiting that freshman class and just creating a much larger roster there for a couple of years.
and the kicker of that is, and if you know any upperclassmen athletes at this point, is you've heard people complain that they just haven't gotten responses from coaches, or there aren't slots available on rosters. I just talked to a coach yesterday who they're going to have 28 guys on a roster, and 8 of them are going to be 6th year seniors. We're not anticipating that as an option. And for a sport of their size, they've never had a roster of that amount. So essentially what happened, and I'll kind of explain the backstory because it will give you an idea of when we might actually finally come out of this disaster from COVID, is anybody who played in the 2021 athletic season, it did not count against student athletes or had a canceled season in spring of 2021. So baseball, softball, men's volleyball, a lot of those student athletes got 2 extra years of eligibility for the most part, because either their seasons didn't happen in the spring of 2020, and in 2021, that season did not count against their eligibility. So some people could have up to 6 years of being on a roster and still only have played 4 plus the COVID year that nobody counted. And so we were looking at significantly more student athletes vying for the same number of slots on a roster. When that happened in the very first year after COVID, nobody who was a senior or going to be a senior or into their 5th year counted against the scholarship total. So even if your scholarship count was supposed to be 12, some schools were covering upwards of 15 to 17 scholarship athletes at any given time. It'll never happen again. But what it did create was a giant bottleneck of resource allocation and roster slots that definitely hurt the next couple of classes. That cascading effect is starting to work itself out of the system. Most of the class of 2023 and 2020, actually, technically the graduates in 2024 will be our last group that are likely to be impacted by that, with the 2025s being maybe the last set of incoming freshmen that'll have any overlap with those. And so we are getting to a stage where those will be through, but it is going to continue to impact the rosters for at least 2 more years. So be aware that that's part of the possibility. Item number 2 on this list has certainly been an adventure for the colleges. About 4 months before COVID hit, the NCAA had the great idea that it used to be that if you wanted to transfer from one college to the other, you had to have a release from the coaches, a release from the athletic department, to even have a conversation with other colleges. And from there, they could deny your ability to leave and go to other schools. Or if you wanted to transfer within your own conference, you would be dinged a year of eligibility. So you would literally only have 3 rather than the usual 4 years of ability to play. The NCAA decided that was a relatively unfair, and the Student Athlete Advisory Council jumped on board and voted to remove the transfer restrictions, which, if you've seen, there's been student athletes at a variety of schools and in a variety of sports that have jumping around all over the place. The transfer portal has created essentially an open market for student athletes. They might play 1 or 2 years, decide they want to go to a higher level program, decide they want to go back closer to home, enter the transfer portal and transfer anywhere with no consideration of eligibility or change in status. And so as long as they're in good academic standing, they can transfer and go anywhere they want in the country without any kind of penalty. And they don't even technically have to tell their coaches till after they already put themselves in the portal. So there is kind of a bit of a wild west. And what we've seen is some of the top talent, especially the ones coming out of these COVID years, are now jumping around and playing their 5th year at a variety of different schools as graduate students. And so that is making the rosters even larger. So you can see the self-fulfilling prophecy that the NCAA has become. To be fair, they didn't know when they made the transfer change that we were going to go into a global pandemic for 2 years, but sometimes the NCAA can't technically be blamed for it, but I'm not sure it was the smoothest process, and COVID kind of covered it up for a few years, but it's certainly going to make some waves moving up here. We are seeing a few restrictions and changes to that transfer portal already. Each sport is going to have its own designated window. It used to be you could put yourself in at any time and transfer whenever you wanted. Now it's going to be down to windows around the beginning and end of each semester to allow students some time to get settled in at their new schools before they start practice. So there will be a few changes, but it's still going to be relatively open season. So it's going to change the landscape significantly for student athletes moving forward. So it's best to make sure that you're doing your due diligence to make sure it's a school you really want to be at before you make a commitment. It saves yourself a lot of headaches if you don't have to go through jumping around campus to campus in order to do what you need. We talked a little bit during this presentation. We're going to try to wrap this up a little bit so you guys have some time to ask questions, but there's a bunch of resources that you have the ability to peruse through that are going to give you more information on this and the process we've been talking about. The first one on here is the link to the NCAA Eligibility Center. As Galen pointed out, you can do this at pretty much any time. If you're a freshman, sophomore, and even the beginning of junior year, you're not going to have all the information you need. You'll have to just don't lose your password. The NCAA is really bad about the reset the password part of this. So try to make sure whatever you do, save your password somewhere so you have it and you can get back into your account. You're going to hold most of your information until you have test scores in your completed first semester senior year transcripts. Eventually, you'll have to submit your final transcripts, but across the board, that's the information you're going to need along with answering a bunch of questions. And that's all you have to do to register with the Eligibility Center. Okay. The second one on here, if you're interested in deep diving a little farther into the rules that we've been talking about or getting more information on any specific sports, ncaa.org is where we house all of the general rule information. On there, you have access to the NCAA recruiting manual. So you'll be able to see that lovely 400-page manual I was talking about that has all the NCAA rules in it and the exam college coaches get to, well, they used to take it every year. I think we're now an open book and you can pretty much not blow it, but theoretically, they're supposed to know all the rules themselves. On there, you guys can actually go in and see recruiting calendar by sport. So you'll be able to see specific to each sport the exact timelines you're talking about, when recruiting can start by division, all of the information that you need. If you're have a set of schools in mind, but you don't know what division they're in or don't necessarily know what conference they're in, I recommend going and taking a look at ncaa.com. That one's more, you'll be able to keep updated with scores of sports at different levels. You'll be able to follow all the NCAA tournaments for all of the sports at Division 1, 2, and 3. And it's a really great place for more information in general. The fourth big resource we always talk about is talking to your coaches, whether that's high school, club, AAU, private instructors, depending on sport, making sure you talk to the people that you're with and get their evaluation and opinion on potential options and where you might go in terms of the college and divisions. Most coaches, if any of their athletes have ever played in college before, will have a pretty decent idea of where you'll fit and will be able to recommend like, oh, you're a lot like X, Y, and Z student athlete, and they went to these kinds of schools. That should give you a pretty good idea of what you're up against, places you should be considering. And the final one on here, guys, Pally, you guys have a wonderful college center. Make use of your college counselors. They're there to help you. get in there, get some FaceTime. So if you need some things like unofficial transcripts to send to a college coach, they will know who you are, and it'll be less of an ask if you get in front of those guidance counselors nice and early. And as always, here are Great Expectations. Galen and I are both members, or we are technically the only two members of the athletic recruiting staff here at Great Expectations. But between us, we're looking at about 25 years of experience. So if you guys have any questions or you need anything, please feel free to reach out to us via the website. There's also always the free 30-minute consultation with the woman who is in charge. Jen is wonderful, but she will happily sit down, speak with your families one-on-one, and then get you to the appropriate resources. All right. It looks like at this point, we're going to open it up for questions. Galen and I will do our best to kind of go back and forth to answer these as best we can. So if you have any, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A function.
Yeah, so looks like the first couple questions are along the same path. They're really asking about how schools being test optional are impacting the SAT and ACT for the NCAA Eligibility Center.
Okay, well, technically, the NCAA during 2021, 2022, 2023 waived the requirement for SATs and ACTs for student athletes. 2024, they will not vote on whether or not they're going to require it for that graduating class until January of this year, and that will be a decision at the athletic director's level. Now, the NCAA Eligibility Center and the admissions offices are two completely different sets of humans. So just understand, each school is going to have a recommendation. Even if a school is test optional, if the NCAA says you need to set a test course in order to play, then you need to take it. However, as Galen and I pointed out earlier, this is a sliding scale. So if you're a 4.0 student, you're doing great, and you have to take it just for NCAA eligibility, you only need to clear about a 770 combined on the SATs. Now, it always pays to give it a shot and try to do well on it. However, whatever test scores are shared with the NCAA are not ones that you necessarily have to share with the college admissions offices. Those are simply for NCAA eligibility purposes and not meant for any admission standards. And so again, schools being test optional, it's going to entirely depend on whether or not the NCAA makes the test scores a requirement or whether or not they leave it open. All right. Next one up. Galen, you can answer this one. It says, my son is a junior who just switched sports from soccer to football. He's a kicker / punter. Is it too late for him to start the process?
Definitely not, especially being still pretty early in that junior year. We're only looking like it's mid-October still. Has a lot of time to still look at options, communicate with coaches, and have a really good, fulfilling recruiting process.
100%. And with that, the fact that he's moving positions in, honestly, being a soccer player very often helps to be a great punter and kicker. He's going to have the likelihood, especially if he was pretty good and making an impact now. It really comes down to talent versus long-term potential. College coaches, when they're out recruiting, are trying to make a decision. If your son is a junior, they're going to try to make a decision on whether or not he could potentially impact their roster 6 years from now when he's a senior. Is this somebody who's going to be a solid contributing member of our program by the time they're ready to graduate? And if the answer is yes, especially if he's just switched sports, if he's pretty good, but he hasn't yet refined his skills as a football player, he could be in really great shape. In terms of, they'll take a look at him and say, he's very new to this, he's just learning, and he's already doing X, Y, and Z. He'll be in really great place for that.
Is there a good resource that lists the schools by their division, Katie?
There is. So as we listed earlier, the ncaa.com, you can see each sport, each division, and there'll be lists housed on that website that tell you what school is what. This is going to also sound ridiculous, but one of the resources that does a great job with this is actually Wikipedia. Who knew? I was actually looking through resources the other day, and they do a great job of categorizing schools by divisions. And you can look up your sport and the division, and they are actually listed out by conference, which is pretty cool. And surprisingly, both the ncaa.com and weirdly Wikipedia, I can't believe I'm actually recommending that, makes my brain hurt, but they have kept up with the changes to athletic programs during COVID. So some schools dropped sports, some schools added sports to increase enrollment. And so those have changed significantly over the last couple of years. And that is a place that has very much bumped up, and they've kept track of everything that's changed, and it's been great. So there should be a fairly up-to-date list of everything there. All right. Okay, next one up is, how does the walk-on process work? Galen, you want this? You want me to take it?
No. Walk-on process, and Katie can jump in at any time, pretty similar to a scholarship athlete. Really where it divides and kind of goes down the different forks is if we're signing that NLI or we're going after our financial aid and signing our commitment as a university after we get admitted to the program. But everything up until that point, you can still talk to coaches the same, you can still communicate the same, they can watch you play, you'll visit campus. A lot of those are still going to occur the exact same way, irrelevant if you're going to do the walk-on or if you're going to be a scholarship athlete.
Yeah, the coaches handle that process nearly identically, and they'll just tell you whether or not they have a scholarship available to offer you. Okay. And then coaches are very, I will tell one thing they are good at is being very upfront. Okay, probably outside of major sports, football, men's basketball, women's basketball, a little different. But for the most part, the coach's integrity and their ability to get the right kids is going to be whether or not they keep their job. And so they are very open and honest about where the program stands, scholarship availability, and what your student athlete's position is going to be within their depth charts and program. So you'll know in the process exactly where you stand and whether it's a walk-on opportunity or a scholarship opportunity, and it will work exactly the same way no matter what they're doing.
The next question is going to be one of Katie's favorites. So follow up to the soccer player turned punt turned kicker. So do camps like Kohl's actually connect student athletes with coaches, or are they more of a money-making venture?
Oh, yes, this is my favorite question. The answer is, it depends on the camp. For me, the ID and talent camps are often at least halfway decent in terms of if the colleges that you're interested are going to be there, it's worth going. You can meet the coaches, you can get to know them. You'll, if nothing else, get a really good feel for their coaching style on the field and get to spend some time with them, get in front of them and learn their personalities. That's invaluable in the recruiting process, no matter what. If it's a general college summer camp, go into it with the thought process of, I'd like to see what it's like to live on this campus, to sleep in the dorms, to eat meals in the cafeteria. But a general large college camp on their campus is probably not a great way to be noticed as an athlete, because there's just simply too many kids and not enough coaching staff and eyes on the student athletes for that. But when it comes to those bigger showcase and talent ID camps, and this is for pretty much every single sport, the time it makes sense to go is when there's schools there that you really want to see. But if it's a great camp and there's a ton of coaches, but there aren't any ones that you want to actually talk to, then it may not be worth it, no matter how good of a camp it actually is. And with that, usually before registration, you can reach out to whoever is running the camp and ask them for the list of schools that are confirmed to be there, because they're always going to put the big ones on the website, but there's usually an extensive list of additional schools that will also be attending those that may not make the website and the splashy front page.
Katie, what are some of the ways that Great Expectation is going to help through this process? For instance, do they help with what kids stay? Do they help when to reach out to coaches, videos, etc.?
The answer is all of it. So again, you have two former college coaches that are here. So we can help with everything from template emails to introduce yourself to coaches, creating lists of schools for you to consider based on academic goals, athletic talent, things that we're looking for. We can help with video. I will tell you, for most sports, there are probably people who can do it with a better eye for specifically what your sport is looking for, but we can provide guidance and, if necessary, can create videos for your student athletes, or connect you with somebody who might be great for your sport specific video. On top of that, we can help you with this process of, okay, every 4 to 6 weeks, we want to be sending a follow-up email. Here's what should be included. Here's the kinds of things you should be doing, and kind of be an all-encompassing point of contact for what we're looking for. So especially if it's volleyball, we've got you covered. How's that for an answer? But again, most of us Galen and I both worked in several college athletic departments, and so have contacts within the college world. If we don't have the answer, we can generally find it out for you. Galen, you want to give the ask and I'll answer the next one? We got a new one.
Yeah. What sports have the most openings in terms of scholarships that aren't obvious, like rowing, etc., that might offer more opportunities beyond the obvious impacted football, basketball?
Ironically, it's much easier to get on a football roster. There are 85 scholarships for football and like 175 guys on the roster. There is nobody who's going to have more spaces than them. But yeah, across the board, you'd have to go and look. It's going to be entirely different by school. Like there are some schools where a rowing team has 60 people and they're offering Honestly, I'd have to go look at the maximum number of scholarships, but you can actually look at the NCAA website will list the total potential amount of scholarships offered, but not every school offers the maximum for each sport either. There are some where it's easier to get onto a roster at a larger school. Those would be sports that aren't played either before college. So rowing as an example, there's not very many people who row prior to college. So if you have rowing experience going into college, you're more likely to find a home. I will tell you, at quite a variety of schools, they literally walk around campus looking for the tall people with the right build, and they'll ask them if they want to row. But that's, again, they're going to be carrying 60 kids. That doesn't necessitate that they're going to end up with a scholarship. But in as plain of terms as I can make it, there is no easy way to get a scholarship, and there's no easy sports to get them in. Less than 2% of college athletes or student athletes playing at the college level are going to have scholarships. Majority of them are going to be walk-ons, and our largest division by far is Division III. Division I, at their most number of sports, has 330 participating, actually I think 334 now participating schools. Division II only at 180 as a maximum. Division III has 440. So majority of our college athletes are not receiving any form of scholarship to play in college. So it is certainly not going to be easy to find a scholarship. And you have to be incredibly proficient in your sport in order to get one. So that's sort of something to think about. Is it's not necessarily, it might be easier to get on a roster, but it's certainly not going to be easier to get a scholarship for it. Oh,
Katie's other favorite question.
My second favorite question are, should you set up a recruiting profile on a recruiting site? I always say, if it's free, go for it, but just be prepared for what might come with that. There is a service that peddles to pretty much every sport in the United States. It's called NCSA. If they contact you, run screaming in the opposite direction as fast as you can possibly go. Galen and I laugh because as college coaches, this is something we saw a lot. We would get hundreds of emails a day from that recruiting service. They're basically a mile wide and about an inch deep. Their algorithm says a kid fills out the profile on there and they spam email every college coach in the nation. So if your student athlete only cares about playing sport at the college level and they don't care where they go, like, Southwest Directional State Institution of Arkansas, they might be the only people you hear back from on that platform. So I always recommend to steer clear of the paid recruiting sites. Each sport will often have their own site where you can put up recruiting information, but it's generally free to the students. And so anything that's above even a high-end profile at like $50 is about where I would make your cutoff. You shouldn't have to pay for it. You can do just as much with an email account and a YouTube account as you can with a recruiting profile. No matter what the recruiting site says, college coaches are going to want to hear directly from a student athlete and not necessarily from a recruiting service, and they aren't going to want an intermediary. The quicker that they can speak directly with the student athlete, the more likely that the process is going to work, because that's who they're recruiting. So that will definitely be something about that. And yes, to the mother who wanted to know if they walk around looking for rowers, yes, they absolutely do. 3 of my friends who were volleyball players became rowers in college because they were all tall, broad shoulders, and built correctly for a boat. So that was always fun. Okay, Galen, how about this one? What about playing at a community college and trying to transfer?
Yeah, and that is a fantastic option for a variety of students. A lot of the junior colleges, community colleges here in California have sports that compete here in California, and there are community colleges around the country. Outside of California, they compete in a little bit of a different division, but all those are great options and have the ability to transfer. The big things to remember are you still have that kind of clock, regardless of where you start, is you still have the 5 years to compete 4 seasons. And if you're starting at a community college, that starts against that eligibility clock. And then the other piece about it is, depending on how your eligibility center works in high school, and if you pass that eligibility center, it's going to determine what sorts of grades, or if you need an associate's degree to be able to transfer and matriculate from that community college to a 4-year university. So each situation is going to be a little bit different, which is a really good option for a lot of students.
Save some money, especially if you're not going to be on scholarship early, gets your general education requirements out of the way. And quite frankly, especially the junior college system here in the state of California is incredibly robust with strong academics, and those students have solid outcomes when they transfer to 4-year schools later on. I would, if you're interested in it for a specific sport, I would do some homework on which schools and which junior colleges are getting student athletes out to the bigger schools that you might want to attend. Where are their student athletes ending up after they leave the junior college? But it's a wonderful option. And like I said, here you have some tremendous junior colleges that do a great job with the academic piece and preparation of student athletes for college. All right. Oh, we got a couple more here.
Yeah. And then we still have about 4 that we came in before the webinar started that we should cover as well.
Yes. All right. Well, the next one up here, I will ask the question and answer it, I guess. We have someone who says, I have a son that's a great student who just started a new sport last year and is a junior this year. He's open to playing sports, but it's not a requirement for him. Does it make sense for him to go through the recruiting process prior to attending college? And yes, it absolutely makes sense. We talk about athletic recruitment as a parallel path. For most students, even if they do end up playing a sport in college, they're still looking at regular colleges and they're moving down both paths. Recruiting is one piece of it. So reaching out to schools that you're interested in, seeing if you might be a fit athletically, talking to the coaches, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that those are going to be the right fit of schools when the time comes. So say you're, a lacrosse player and you're looking at Trinity College in Connecticut and you're looking at Haverford in Philadelphia for recruiting purposes, and you're also looking at UCLA and Cal Berkeley. You apply, you're getting to that stage and you're trying to decide, and you like the bigger school that maybe athletics isn't going to be a piece. And at that point, you could let the coaches that you've been talking to know, hey, look, I've decided I maybe don't want to play in college or I'll play club, but I want to go to a bigger school. This isn't going to be a fit for me. But the thing about the recruiting piece is you still want to be preparing for the application process in case things don't go the way that you're hoping for. So it's more of a parallel path rather than choosing one or the other. Okay, the last one. Galen and I also will enjoy this. So we have one here that says, can you choose any major of study if you are a student athlete?
The unfortunate answer is going to be no.
And it depends, really, we talked a little bit about this earlier, it depends on division and student athlete experience. So the higher up you go, the less amount of control you're going to have over your time outside of playing a sport. So there's a lot of colleges, if you're playing at that top Power 5 level of division we're talking about, your coaches and academic advisors will say, okay, cool, we have practice from 8 to 10 a.m. and then we have X, Y, and Z at 4 p.m. So all of your classes have to fit in the middle of that. That's it. Okay. If you're at, say, a smaller Division I, like the Ivy League school is our Division I. Well, you're a student first there. Your practices are run around the class schedules. Division III athletes, you're going to class, you're going to practice late if they overlap, those kinds of things. But it's going to be a school by school, conference by conference, usually academic rigor by academic rigor consideration. But the higher up you go in the food chain of athletics, the less control you have over those academic options. So not impossible, but difficult to do some of what we call progression-based majors. If you're going to play at a high level of Division I, progression-based majors would be like engineering. You have to take certain classes in a certain order at a certain time in order to graduate. And that can't always happen if the classes conflict with practice time or any of your other schedules. Nursing would be another one. The sheer volume of clinicals or things that you might need to do that and balance being a student athlete in a Power 5 conference is incredibly difficult. Again, it's been done before, but you'd have to have some pretty sincere and thoughtful conversations with coaches, knowing the expectation going in is that generally you're going to be looking for a specific experience is the best way I can put it. And it ranges everything. You have to talk to coaches individually and see what their philosophy is on the athletic, academic, and student experience balance.
Katie and Galen, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and close questions on the Q&A for now, but as Galen mentioned, I do have a couple that were submitted in advance. If you've got a couple minutes, we can toss those out there. Okay. The first one is when to start the process if your interest is in schools on the opposite coast.
The same exact time as the ones on this coast. It's more to do with when can you figure out visiting the campuses. The earlier you start, the more time you have to gather information, the more likelihood that you're going to see the campuses before you have to make any decision. But it doesn't matter what coast you're on necessarily, is the recruiting process is going to start at the same time for just about everybody.
Thank you so much. The next one is, if you're playing a sport with a scholarship and need a 5th year to complete your undergraduate degree, does the scholarship continue?
That depends on your eligibility clock, and it depends on whether or not there's a scholarship available, and it depends on whether or not you have gotten through all of your programming. So needing the 5th year doesn't require that the coaches keep you on scholarship. If you've exhausted your 4 years of eligibility, you will not continue receiving a scholarship for the 5th year. If you do what we call a red shirt at some point during your first 4 years, then they theoretically could keep you on scholarship and play that 5th year. I will say for a lot of students, though, that end up in that 5th year to finish, the schools do offer, you can go back into the regular financial aid and merit-based aid. So if you've done a great job at the school, oftentimes there will still be aid available and you can receive some form of scholarship, but it wouldn't necessarily be athletic.
The other thing I would just add on to that is most coaches have that conversation pretty early on. So you can have that kind of guiding principle, whether, hey, are we going to try and do this in 4 years or going to do that 5th year? It's usually a pretty open conversation.
Big time, because they have to be able to plan their future program, classes, and needs for each graduating class 4 to 6 years out as they're starting to look at athletes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our last one of the evening is going to be, what is the risk of taking a gap year?
For an athlete, you need to be doing something in that gap year. I did work with one student who's currently playing in Spain for a year before coming back and attempting the recruiting process. That's doable, but you need to be doing something. Student athletes, especially, it's not necessarily a gap year you would be taking. It would be like a postgraduate year. So especially in certain sports, I will say it's incredibly prominent in ice hockey, in men's lacrosse, and in basketball to take a prep school year. And quite frankly, there's a huge concentration of prep schools, essentially a boarding school, up especially in the New England area. There's an entire conference called the NEPSAC. It's the New England Private School Athletic Conference, where there's something like 18 boarding schools where they offer postgraduate years for students that want to take that year, beef up their academics, lift, get stronger, prepare for college sports in hopes of a better recruiting outcome. But an actual true gap year where you're off, traveling Europe or hanging out or taking an internship isn't likely going to be the answer for our athletes.
Katie and Galen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with everyone tonight. For those of you that were joining us, if you did not get any of your questions answered, you can reach us through any of the means on the screen right now, phone, email. You can submit a question through our website as well. We are here for you. So thank you all for attending tonight, and I hope everyone has a good evening.